Hi everyone, I'm Meishin and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this new and first video about Meishin Tale, behind the scene. In this first series, we'll talk about creating an open world environment for your game and how to obtain and achieve the same results or something similar as you need of a Meishin Tale. This series will be split into 3 parts. The first part will be about the terrain itself. How to set up a basic terrain, what are the choices you have, how you can get better results. In the second video, we will see more in detail the trees and the vegetation and the props that you can add on your basic terrain. In the third video, we will see more in depth how to make your world more responsive, either to some players' action or even to some climate change, etc. Let's go into the first part of this tutorial, the terrain itself. So we will see first what are our basic options here. You have the Unity terrain, or you can have custom 3D models. What are the pros and cons of both? Which one you should prefer depending on your goals. Then we will discuss more in depth about the Unity terrain itself, speaking about its limitations and the solutions to those limitations. We will then look at some assets that you could use to improve the quality of your terrain, as well as the performance and some other stuff. And then we'll go more in detail about how the terrain works in itself. Okay, so if you're ready, let's get started! So let's start by looking at how we can create a basic Unity terrain. Let's launch Unity. For your information, I'm using 2019, but it would be the same on 2018 and probably 17. Here, let's create a new scene. In this scene, simply create a new terrain. So great, we have a brand flat terrain. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see we have no texture on it. So then just select the paint terrain option, and here I will raise or lower terrain. Then selecting the brush, so here we have a nice brush with some blur, here it's more sharpened. Then I can change here the brush size and the opacity of the brush. So let's take this brush, which seems very nice. Simply by clicking on your terrain, you can add some height. If you shift click, you will lower the height. If you look at here and I shift click, nothing happens, because by default the terrain is at 8.0 and can't be lowered beneath 0. If you want to carve, the best is to first raise all of your terrain to a specific height. So for example here, you put set height, flatten all, you put it to 100 and let's go. And now if I want to lower my terrain, it's very fine. Let's shape quickly something that would look like a mountain with a little valley. You can always play with the brush, its size, and also the splats in order to obtain a more natural look. Okay, so we have a basic shape, but still no texture. Now we just go here in Paint Texture. In here, you can see I have no terrain layer. So you need first to add some and create a layer. A layer is just some information for the terrain that contains the texture and some other small information. It's much like a material in Unity. Let's add some sound. The first layer you create will cover everything. So then just create a second layer. This time let's put some rock. So now we're gonna add some rock on the peak of the mountain. This looks ugly. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit. Well, the pattern is very little. We can see it repeating widely. Also, the pattern is very regular. So yeah, let's change the texture of this layer to have something a little less pattern-like. I can just click here, open, and what we have here are the different textures used for this layer, with the metallic and smooth regarding how the light should be reflected. And then we have the tiling settings, which will define how the pattern is repeated. Here I'm going to change my basic diffuse pattern. And well, it's still quite the same. We can see it repeating over and over. Put the tiling a bit higher. So we can still see some patterns, but it's already much better. We can see that quite flat. Well, it's completely flat in fact. What we're gonna do is add here a normal map. So a normal map will indicate how the light should be reflected. If we look at it, each channel will indicate in which direction an incoming light will be reflected. If we look at the texture again, you can see here some shadows. which gives really more depth to the field. Okay, so if we go back to the terrain, we're gonna do the same here for the sand. You can notice here the blending, which is very linear. Let's try here to take a more sharpened brush. So you can see here it will be much more sharp. However, it gives this kind of fade look, which doesn't seem that natural because we only used normal maps. So both textures are exactly at the same level. As the color is blended quite uniformly here, it gives the impression that we have some dark sand, which is very weird. To continue, we can add again some layers, and what you might want to do is then blend the textures a little bit manually. So taking, for example, this layer, setting a very teeny brush size, and then add manually grass, for example, some rocky grass here and there to make it a little bit less linear. If we look at it closely, we can see here some shadows, and here we can see different textures blending quite okay. And this is how we create a terrain using standard Unity terrain. The other way is to create a shape, a 3D model, directly in a 3D modeling tool. For example, Blender, 3ds Max, Maya, whatever. I'm not very good at those, so I'm gonna show you quickly how we can do it in Photoshop. So here, just open a new layer. Here it's a 2000 by 2000 image. You just mess it around a little bit, knowing that the white will be the height. So here it will be a very huge height, and here it will be a very low height. So yeah, it's gonna look very weird. Okay, so now that we have our basic height layer, what we can do is just go into 3D and create a new mesh from layer with a depth map. So as you can see, it created a 3D model. You can paint it, you can do whatever you want on it, and then you export it as a FBX and import it into Unity. If you're looking for textures, well, there is a very nice site which is called Texture Heaven. Texture Heaven is 100% free with a CC0 license, which means that basically you can do whatever you want with the texture, and it has up to 8K PBR textures, which are really nice. So we can take a look at the textures. You can see here you have all different texture categories. If we look, for example, at the sandstone, let's take this medieval block here and put it on our terrain. I will take all the different maps. If you don't know what are those, well, it's not very important for the moment. The AO is the ambient occlusion, which will help define shadows. The bump, which is giving information about the height. Then you have the diffuse map, which is the basic map, the normal map that we talked about already, and the roughness, which is the opposite of the smoothness you see in Unity. The smoothness, which will give a more or less plastic or even wet or metallic look to our texture. So you can simply here click on all maps, then choose the resolution. 8K resolution is a lot, especially if you put several textures at 8K. At some point you will have some issues with the rendering. Maybe take 4K, which is already a lot, and you can take either PNG or JPEG, and then you just undip it and put it into your folder. So here I put it under material rocks. Now you have to change the type of the normal map. So here you change the texture type to normal map. Also the max size here is set to 2048, whereas we have a 4K resolution. So let's change it to 4000. We're gonna do the same for the diffuse map. And now we're gonna add the layer to our terrain. Okay, so now that we have seen two different ways to create a terrain, you're gonna ask me, yeah, but how do I choose? Well, this is a very good question. So let's take a deeper look at both methods. First, if you look at the customization, well, if you're a custom 3D model, by definition, you can do whatever you want with it. Speaking of the Unity terrain, well, it's very limited. In particular, you can't customize more than what you've seen before. So you can add a normal map, you can change the tiling, and that's all. And all you're left with is to play around with the painter. We will see later that we can add some customization, but through assets. If we look at the ramp-up speed, how fast will you learn to do the stuff? For a custom 3D model, it's very slow. We'll have to learn, for example, Blender, 3ds Max, whatever. So if you don't come already with a certain package, it's gonna be slow and tedious. However, Unity Terrain is very fast. As you have seen here in the video, it takes maybe 3 minutes to take into hand. Then an important criteria, is it dynamic? For a custom 3D model, it's gonna be painful because every time you want to change even a tiny detail of your terrain, you will have to go back into your 3D model software to make the change and then to re-import to Unity. If you want to change very tiny details, it can be burdensome. For the Unity terrain, well, the basic version is quite easily modifiable. There is nothing already pre-built to do it, but it's very easy to do. For the custom 3D model, of course, you will need a custom 3D software, a texture software. So for example, you have a Substance Painter texture, which is very great, in particular because they have a plugin in Unity which helps streamline activities. And for the Unity terrain, well, if you just use the basic terrain, you won't need one. But what we will see just after is because of all the limitations on the terrain, it's very hard not to have to buy or to find some free assets. The next very important point is the performance. If you're building an open world game, at some point the performance will be an issue. If you keep on adding terrain and terrain and terrain and adds trees and foliage and props into them, your FPS will drop quite quickly. With a custom 3D model, well, it's up to you. If your model has a very low trish, then you're gonna be fine. However, if you're building a huge world, you will probably have to segment your work into different areas that you will load or unload given the proximity of the player, for example. Regarding Unity terrain, it's quite the same. There is no in-house build of segmentation. If you try to build a very huge, wide world, at some point you will also hit an issue. Finally, the choice is quite easy. If you want a more graphic, visual level in a tiny environment and your game is more artistic centered than gameplay centered, you can go for the custom 3D model. Also, it would be much preferable if you have already some knowledge into 3D modeling, because otherwise it will be very hard for you. On the other hand, if you want a more gameplay-centered game in which you don't want to spend too much time defining your terrain and its textures, it's best that you go with Unity terrain. So this is why in Meishin Tale we used a Unity terrain. Let's get down to the limits of this terrain. The first limitation of Unity terrain are that you cannot rotate them. Here you have the rotation. If we do whatever here, it's not gonna change anything. Well, you will have a hard time doing it with Unity terrain unless when you land, you create a new scene and you load it. So if you really want to do it with Unity terrain, you will have first to tweak the terrain itself and then to tweak the shader of the terrain. If you are interested in that, well, you'll find a link in my website. The second limit, and for me the worst, are the textures rendering. First, well, it's quite of low quality. If you look at here at this sand, in which I put a diffuse and a normal map, can't really see any depth. I mean, I have some shadows, but that's all. Another issue is the blending. Honestly, this really doesn't look good. And then if I go more on my rocky terrain, I mean, this sand is very weird. It gets darker, and here it's not really better. The solution for that, it's usually not free, but you have several terrain assets that helps you increase the quality of the textures and associated shaders, and also that allows you to blend the different textures in a more natural manner. We will see those terrain assets just after. The third issue is the performance. As we discussed a little bit earlier, well, if you want to make a very huge terrain, at some point there will be an issue, because when your player starts, it will load all the terrain at once and there is no available segmentation into the built-in Unity terrain. And also there is another issue, is that the textures here uses one rendering path every 4 textures. If you want to add on a huge terrain 19 different textures, you will have at least 5 different rendering paths, plus the whole terrain being loaded at the same time. Good luck with that. Again, here some solution exists, and the solution are mainly terrain assets that you can have either free but mostly not free. The fourth issue with the standard Unity terrain is the trees and the foliage handling. You've probably noticed here that you can paint trees, it's very nice, but there are some heavy limitations to that. But we will see that in the next video. The last but not the least, the Unity terrain is not really supported by Unity. It's part of the standard assets, but if one day they want to change the API, we are screwed. Okay, so we've seen that basically the Unity terrains is nice, but with some great limitations. So let's take a look at the best assets for terrain. This list won't be exhaustive, it's only a couple of assets that are well known. If you have some other great assets you have in mind or you have to share, don't hesitate in the comments. Anyway, if you're looking for some assets in the asset store, you can just go on it, here terrain, we'll have already some results. You can then filter here on environments and tools, etc, etc. So the first two are very great tools to generate Unity terrains in a procedural manner, especially if you're looking for some assets that will help you create an infinite world. Those modes are made for you. So the first mode is Ultimate Terrain's Voxel Terrain Engine. This one is quite expensive, as you can see. However, the features are quite impressive. You can modify the terrain procedurally and dynamically. You have an API that you can use in order to modify this terrain at will, either when you are in editor mode or when you are already playing. So it allows to create caves, which is something you can't do on the basic Unity terrains, etc, etc. If you want the full list of what it does, you can check the features here or in the documentation. A second asset you can use to procedurally generate a terrain that could be infinite is Terra. It works the same way as Ultimate Terrains, but with a much more limited functionality. However, here it's totally free. The second two assets I'm gonna share with you are assets relative to textures and shaders of the terrain. So the first asset is CTS, Complete Terrain Shader, which is a complete terrain shaders overhaul, allowing you to add roughness, height, or even tessellation map to your textures. So it gives way more depth to your terrain. Also, you can completely change the way the texture is rendered. It also allows very nice blending of different textures. And in particular, it is very useful to cut the kind of pattern that can appear when putting textures on a large terrain. And finally, performance-wise, all the maps are compressed. And in particular, one rendering path is used every 16 textures, whereas it was only for 4 textures on the Unity standard terrain. Regarding the other asset, well, it's Microsplat. It's very similar to CTS. It's a modular-based plugin, so you can either buy one or every plugins. When you look at each plugin individually, well, you have more functionalities than for the CTS Complete Terrain Shader. To be honest, I started with Microsplat, but I didn't really like the way we take the tool in hand. And in particular, the textures rendered through CTS are really breathtaking. Which is why I finally went for CTS. But let's just see what it can do on our terrain. I modified a little bit our Unity terrain by adding CTS on top of it. As you can see here, the rendering is very nice. It looks like the sand is taking over the rocks. You can also very easily add some snow on top of it, or be it some moss, some lava, whatever you want. And in the next to come video, don't forget to check how you can add CTS to your terrain and change all the settings so that you have a very nice, good looking terrain, with also some very nice performance improvements. To finish, how the Unity terrain works, and well, it applies also to CTS. You have a height map. This height map is a matrix containing in each cell the height of relative terrain cell. For the textures, it's in relation to the layers here. In particular, you don't want to mess this order around. And so if you look at your terrain here and the asset associated, you have a splat alpha map with here each channel representing a layer splat. Layers that you define either on your terrain or on CTS textures. Let's take a look, for example, at the art channel. It defines that everything in red will be covered by our first layer, which is the sand. And then we have the G channel, which will be our second layer, which in our case is this rock with grass thing, and then the blue and the alpha. Yeah, you can ask me, oh, but Meishin, what happens if we have more than 4 textures? Well, simply there are more splat alphas that are added here. So if you have, let's say, anything from 5 to 8, you will have 2 different splat alphas, etc, etc. So this is all for this video. In the next video, we'll look at how to add the vegetation, the foliage and the props to our scene in different manners, since the standard Unity way has even greater limitation than the terrain itself. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Feel free to comment on YouTube or on my website if you have things to share, comments, subject that you would like to see tackled in another video. I will put everything that you need to have on my website, including relevant materials, pieces of codes. So come and join the Meishin Tale community.